Margherita?
Just a clarificatory question. How do you apply the new ET to the cases, literature cases?
That's harder.
Because,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So basically what I did was I said, we've got this core idea of sensory experience where sensory experience represents sensory qualities. And I broadened out and I say, well, it doesn't just represent sensory qualities. It also represents information carried in analog form, nested in the sensory qualities. So I abstracted up, right? I basically took a requirement out, I abstracted away. If you want to, my proposal for Fountain and for works of literature is that we abstract again. So, oh, this is slightly different from what I had on screen before. So before I had a slide back. That's just a mistake of mine. Let me show you. Oh, no, I guess I didn't. So what I meant to say was aesthetic properties are principally represented in states of mind that encode information from the senses in analog form, nested in the properties that realize them for delivery to judgment in digitized form. Take out the from the senses like I did there. And then maybe there are other states, other cognitive states that are non-sensory that nest the being light as bubbles at the brim for the reverse of the metal, the Patrick O'Brien novel.
Imagination or something like that, because of course one might say that imagination, but a perception-like or a sensory-like could maybe have information in analog form, and so it could be an answer.
There are a number of steps you could take. So you could say there's sensory imaginings. So let's loosen up. So it's not from the senses, but it's from the senses or through sensory imaginings. Or you could loosen up even further, because I'm not sure that's going to work for all aesthetic properties attributed to literary works or to Fountain. So maybe not even just through sensory imaginings, maybe through belief-like states.
Yeah, exactly. Also.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the strategy there. But that's far more controversial than what I've just tried to persuade you of here as a good reading of the experience thesis. Thank you.
So, Gregory Currie.
Okay, that's great. I'm not sure this is going to make any sense. So I'm just wondering whether the constraint of nesting is going to require you to settle something about the metaphysics of aesthetic properties in ways that you possibly wouldn't want it to do.
Yes.
So, I mean, if we're talking about the lemoniness, the toastiness, and the balance, so I might say, well, look, I'm fine with lemoniness and toastiness. They're right there. They're in the thing. But balance, you know, that's we're into projection at this point. I'm not a realist about balance, at least in quite the way that I'm a realist about lemoniness.
Yes.
And I just wonder whether if balance is nesting and balance is a real property out there, you're obliged to say that, sorry, lemoniness is a real property out there and balance is nested. Balance has to be a real property out there as well.
I can't give you a full answer to this question because I don't yet know the full answer. So certainly if you're a realist like me, I think the balance is out there. So no problem with that kind of view. If you think that the balance is just a feeling of pleasure and you call it balance, so a kind of a radical anti-realist, then I've assumed you out of court, right? But there's some intermediate positions having to do with dispositional properties. You know, there are a number of intermediate positions, and I'm not so. There's a number of intermediate positions on the metaphysics of aesthetic properties. And then there's the issue of whether we can characterize the nesting relation in a way that's independent of those metaphysical issues. It's possible that there's a general nesting relation that's stronger than reliable correlation, weaker than gnomic necessity or analyticity, and that is not restricted to the aesthetic case. And so we have a really good independent grip on it. And maybe if we can specify that relation, we won't need to worry about the details of the metaphysics. But that's a promissory note. It may turn out that we can't specify the nesting relation without having solved some of those metaphysical issues about the status of aesthetic properties. So I don't know. Some work needs to be done there. If you have a hunch, yeah.
Nothing worth saying.
Yeah, that's a difficult one.
You have said, you have barred the idea that aesthetic property make phenomenal differences. But if then you claim that they are nested in the other properties that realize them, and of course, some, at least some of these properties make a phenomenal difference.
Some do.
So maybe if it is a necessary character of being nested in these realizing properties, of course you have a phenomenal difference.
Absolutely, that's great, thank you. So, this was the reasoning for the conclusion that sensory experiences only represent sensory qualities. There are two assumptions, and I only challenged the first. You're challenging the second. This second is that only sensory qualities make a phenomenal difference, and I was just granting that for the sake of argument. But there are philosophers who think that two is false.
The problem is about what is the impact, the influence of nesting.
Yeah.
If it is just contingent in the fact that the aesthetic properties could be presented without any nesting, you're right. But if it is not, and you say that there is not only digital but analog presentation. Yeah. So in a sense, the mode of presentation of aesthetic property is necessary nesting in these phenomenal differences.
So I'm hearing you saying that the balance makes a phenomenal difference. Tasting the balance of the wine is a...
I think that the balance cannot be isolated of the different taste that you... Of course, I agree that is at a rather different status because we can extract the notion of balance and use it in a judgment, for example. But the first appearance of the property is necessary.
Okay, I think I'm okay with that. So there are two views. One is that you taste the balance, but its phenomenology is just the lemmoniness and the toastiness, and maybe some liking. That's the phenomenology. Another view is you taste the lemmoniness and the toastiness, they make a phenomenal difference, and the balance makes a phenomenal difference, and the liking makes a phenomenal difference. And I'm neutral between those two options. I'm not taking a side. There are some philosophers who deny two, and so they do want to take a side on that. So there's a big movement in contemporary philosophy of perception to deny two. Susanna Siegel at Harvard is the leader of this.
Yeah, thank you for this very fluid talk. I really perceived its aesthetic qualities. And I don't know if it has any relevance, but you probably know that one of the biggest issue in cognitive science, and I predict that it will become the main, is about what analog representations can do. Yeah. And the main view has been for a long time, with Jerry Fodor and the language of thought, that to combine representation, to make inferences, you have to digitalize. And now with the paradigm of embodied cognition, it seems that maybe analog representation can be combined. They can they can produce inferences while keeping their analog format without digitalization. I think you will say that you are neutral on that, but the first question is whether the relation of nesting is linked in some way with inference, And second question, much more general, is do you think like philosophy of art and aesthetic can contribute in some way and begin and gain importance in the debate on cognitive science, help in some way to solve the question about what analog representations can do?
Oh, okay. So first, nesting and inference. Well, inferences will give you analytic nesting, because inference is a truth-preserving relation. I think that's an analytic relation, right? So there's that. I don't tie analogicity to modularity. And so there's another issue in that literature that you're referring to. And I don't, in fact, the whole idea here is that you can have one sensory modality that is presenting us with experiences that make a phenomenal difference, and thereby presenting us with the representation, with aesthetic qualities. And the aesthetic qualities are partly represented as a result of qualities that don't make a phenomenal difference, like the artist movements. And so that the multimodality there would go against this kind of modularity view. I doubt that this idea can be very helpful in adjudicating disputes in this literature. I do think that what I think can be useful here is that if you're a humanistic art scholar, you're not just interested in psychological mechanisms and liking responses. You're interested in a whole bunch of stuff in between. And this is a way of understanding how you can get all of that stuff consistent with these results about liking and psychological mechanisms, neural mechanisms. That's the bridging proposal. So I'm happy if I can say something that will be helpful there. I don't think. Yeah, I'm not gonna, none of this is gonna persuade Fodor versus, yeah, Koslin, et cetera.
Yeah, I'm working with the analogy between the balance in the wine and the calmness in the Syrah. So let me see if I can set this up. The balance in the wine seems to me to be open to the kind of explanation that Sibley gives of aesthetic properties, right? The non-aesthetic properties are the toastiness and the lemoniness. And for somebody with taste, with the right palate, they will taste the balance in the wine in experiencing those non-aesthetic properties of the wine. So what have we got in the analogous case with the Syrah? We need something that, for the person with taste, will result in the judgment there's a calmness in the way in which it's represented. And I take it that the claim is going to be that what I see is a distribution of colors, but I also see the artist's gestures. Right. It seems to me that there's a sense in which, if that's right, all it does is call into question, again, this question about when we say we're dealing with sensory qualities or sensory experience. Because you might say, well, of course, I see a brushstroke. I don't see a mark. Right? We see brushstrokes, and brushstrokes are things produced by gestures of artists. So of course we see brushstrokes. So there's nothing problematic about this. Of course we see gestures. If you mean by that more than we see brushstrokes, so that in some sense, because the brushstroke carries much more specific information about precisely the gesture that the artist used to execute the brushstroke, then it seems to me it's much more questionable that is something that I respond to when I say I see calmness in the picture. It would be rather like saying, since the toastiness of the wine is the result of a particular kind of fermentation process, right? It carries information about that fermentation process, but surely I don't then want to say that in some sense that's one of the things that I sense when I then judge the wine to be balanced.
Yes, so the idea is here, Stéphanie and Jérôme and the gang are saying, you know, when you're looking at the Pointilly's painting in the compatible, in the various conditions, your visual experience is carrying information about the two grips, actually the 3 grips, the hand down as well. Carrying information about that, that's basically what the priming and associative learning does, right? It establishes that. And I'm saying, okay, so there's a problem. Suppose that the grips are realizers of the calmness. Then do the grips enter into a sensory experience? Well, not if sensory experiences only represent sensory qualities. But I'm saying sensory experiences don't just represent sensory qualities. They represent information carried about realizers. You're saying, okay, but why would you think that the grips are realizers of the calmness? And this is a matter for criticism, right? Maybe they're not, maybe they are. But you can certainly imagine some cases in which the grip is a realizer for an aesthetic property that you attribute to a work. Yes?
We'll talk about this.
Yeah?
Gregory Currie again? No? Yes, yes.
So I just wonder whether you think your view is better in some way than, say, the following view, which is that aesthetic properties are not represented in sensory experience, but they are made available to us by sensory experience in a non-inferential way. So would that, suppose that, I put that up beside yours,
Yeah.
Is there a reason to prefer yours to that one?
I don't know what to say about this. There's a debate going on in the literature about the perception of moral properties, like seeing an act to be cruel, seeing the cruelness of what that boy is doing to that boy, about whether that is just non-inferential, what's going on there is non-inferential, or if the cruelness is in the content. It's not just that it's non-inferential, but it's in the content. And what difference does these 2 claims make? And there's a exactly analogous problem here. So this is really about how do we argue for the experiential thesis. My hunch is that there will be things that we can explain by thinking that the balance is represented in the sensory experience and not just made available non-inferentially. That's my hunch, but it's early days, so I don't have an argument for that yet.
But you don't think that the phenomenology of aesthetic experience decides between those 2?
I don't trust phenomenology as an adjudicator of highfalutin theoretical claims like this. It's just phenomenology. The phenomenology of our experience is not going to do the work there. I don't believe that for a moment. It's going to be, there's some things that we need to explain about the way we make judgments, our aesthetic practices, our appreciative practices. If we can agree on some facts to be explained, I think that that's the way to determine whether or not this thesis is true.
So I try just, I think it's a clarification question. So what about fountain? So, and how your framework applies to conceptual art?
Yeah. So, I want to go back to this statement. I thought that I had a slightly different version of the thesis up here. So this thesis, I actually want to suggest to you something stronger. Aesthetic properties are characteristically represented in states of mind that encode information from the senses, the sensory transducers, the eyes, the ears, and so on, in analog form, ... But I actually took out that from the senses. I don't know why. Bad. But without the from the senses, so it's exactly the same as the answer to Margarita on literature. So, okay, so I think that, it's kind of hard to imagine this, but suppose that you read Thierry de Duve, Kant after Duchamp, and you now know all about fountain, and this puts you in kind of a cognitive state that consists in a complex set of beliefs and attitudes, and right, there's all this stuff that's going on in your head. It could be that all that stuff that's going on your head nests the information that it's cheeky and ingenious. And if so, the information, not non-analytically and non-nomically. And if so, that information is carried in analog form. It fits this definition. right? This is going out on a limb, but yeah. Good. Thank you.